I will explain. The speaker who is unfortunately absent at the moment is Dr. Pakon Priyakorn, who is the Dean at the Graduate School of Public Administration of the National Institute of Development Administration, NIDA, and he is also the President of the Foundation of the Islamic Center of Thailand. His car has broken down due to overheating at Nana, but he is at this moment, as I speak, on his way here through various means. So he will be joining us very shortly. We also have on our panel this evening, closest to me, Dr. Mike Hayes, who works at Mahidol University Center for Human Rights Studies. He has done that for 7 years. He is the program coordinator of the Masters in Human Rights. Mike is from Australia and actually specializes on human rights issues in Burma and Cambodia. Furthest away from me is Mr. Nick Ferryman, who is lecturer in the Humanities and Foreign Languages Division of Mahidol University and Vice Chairman of the PSC Thailand. He's also a founding member and frequent contributor to the Bangkok Post and The Nation. I repeat what I said before the film, that we do have some free seats closer to the front here, so don't be shy, do please come up to the front and join in things a little bit more intimately here. During the time we will be listening to the two speakers, I am convinced that Dr. Pakon will be joining us. Could I please ask Mike Hayes to start first?
Sure. Okay, thanks. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the human rights context to what we saw in the film, and also about some of the issues more generally. Now, as Stuart mentioned, my area of expertise isn't the Middle East, and isn't Palestine, and it's one of those areas that you want to be cautious about getting into, mainly because it's just so complex, and there is a lot of quite tricky and also quite contested issues. However, what I thought, I'd just use this opportunity to talk a bit about some of these terms and concepts which are being used, and also some of the kind of arguments around them. In particular, looking at this film, I think there are three kind of issues which it raises. The first one is about the status of human rights defenders and their protection. You know, a lot of people say, why was she there? You know, could she be there? You know, is she allowed to be there? The second one is about the destruction of property, because as you know, the whole background of the film are these caterpillar bulldozers, then destruction of property, and that is quite an important issue here in terms of the international law and in terms of what's going on in Palestine. The third topic, I'll just touch briefly on some of the issues about the current blockade and how that's affecting concerns about human rights. So just to start with the issue of human rights defenders, it's been quite a growing concern at the United Nations in the past probably decade that the human rights defenders need special protection. Human rights defenders are widely attacked. Their security is not that safe in a whole range of countries. In fact, most countries, human rights defenders probably need more protection. And so as a result of this, we had the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which came out in 1999. And some of the standards of this says that you do have a right to defend human rights. You do have a right to peacefully defend human rights. You do have a right to distribute education about human rights. And states also have a duty to protect and not to target human rights defenders. So human rights defenders do have the right to assemble, they do have the right to freedom of expression, they do have the right to, as we're seeing here, peacefully protest. Where it gets a bit debatable is that they do have to do this within compliance of the law. Now it seems here, I'm not exactly sure about what the status of the law was in the area that she was, but it seemed like there was no special law not allowing her to be there, or otherwise I'm sure they wouldn't be allowed in the country. So it seems like the actual right to protest was available. The next question that's often said is that well, is this an act of a war crime or a murder in this particular case? I think that'll be quite difficult, because I know that the reports, what happened with Rachel Corrie, there were questions that this should be investigated as a war crime or investigated as a murder. I'm sure what happened is a tragedy, and there are quite clearly incompetence and lack of responsibility going on. But in order to determine that she was murdered, you have to determine that the Caterpillar driver deliberately drove over her. Now, obviously, there was kind of levels of incompetence or levels of lack of responsibility going on there. But we're never going to know if that Caterpillar driver deliberately killed her. That doesn't mean that there's an innocence there, that there's not a crime going on, or there's not some level of responsibility there. But the level of responsibility is more around the levels of protection that should be shown in terms of this event. A much more clearer-cut one was the event that happened, I think, a couple of months later to the English guy, Tom Hurdnall. He was shot with a bullet in the head. That's clearly a crime. That's clearly a war crime. There's no question about that. Even if the person was aiming to miss him, because the soldier shouldn't have been aimed at him. He was clearly distinguished as a civilian. He was shot by a high-powered bullet from a sniper. There wasn't any conflict going on at the time. Without a doubt, that's clearly a case of a war crime. It is kind of interesting that in these events, that she has been picked more as the point of advocacy there, and perhaps this is more about with the NGOs deciding tactics about who's the best advocate. They're having a US citizen is obviously quite important there, but still, I think this is not to deny that that the events that went on were quite tragic and also didn't need to occur. For a start, when people say that she shouldn't have been there, the obvious reply to that is, the bulldozer shouldn't have been there either, and that so she did have there was a right to be there, and there were human rights to be defended there. As you could see then in the actions that were going on, the rights to property, rights to livelihood, people's security, a whole range of areas in which there were rights to be protected, and that people had a right to be there. I know that some of the interesting kind of after effects about that were there have been attempts to make lawsuits against Caterpillar tractors. I think, from what I last understand, is that all these lawsuits have finished, but through various means like Alien Torts Acts, a way of suing the company that produces these, there can be some justice coming through the courts. But I think that they were trying this through the US courts, and most of those cases against the Caterpillar tractor makers or bulldozer makers has stopped. Okay, so the next topic I want to look at is then looking at what laws apply, because this is quite important in terms of the occupied territory, because one of the tactics which is often used by Israel is to kind of cherry pick the laws that they want to use. And so it means that there can be that there's a justification of some actions while other actions are kind of ignored or dismissed. That by being able to kind of cherry pick international laws and selectively choose what interpretation you give to events means that you're not forced to comply, or you're not duty bound, or you make it appear that you're not duty bound by various laws. Now, in terms of the jurisdiction, this is kind of complex, because Israel considers that the territories are disputed territories and they're not under Israel jurisdiction. And so that was their argument for much of the past couple of decades. However, then recently they said, when they withdrew from Palestine in 2005, that they were withdrawing occupying power. And so kind of post-event, they made a post-acknowledgement of being an occupying power, which meant that now they were no longer an occupying power. They didn't have responsibilities there anymore. So this is an example of tactically kind of get away from the issue of whether your laws should be in jurisdiction there. Now, the case quite clearly is, and this is from numbers of international bodies, is that Israel is the governing power, is the effective power there, and exercises effective power, and therefore laws that Israel has should be in power there. And this is things like the human rights laws which exist in Israel. And Israel has signed 6 or so of the major human rights treaties: torture, civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights, women's rights, children's rights, and I think Convention Against Racial Discrimination. So because Israel is the existing power there, its laws should also extend to the occupied territories. Now, this has been a concern recently in terms of United Nations arguments, because we've had the case of Guantanamo, where America was saying, well, Guantanamo isn't actually American territory, therefore we don't have to apply our laws there. And it was found through various UN treaty bodies and mechanisms that if you are the exercising power, you do have to exercise your laws as well. And so this is also related to the laws which are in Israel. Further to that, it's also been recognised that the Geneva Conventions, in particular the Fourth Geneva Convention about the protection of civilians in conflict, is also enforced there. Now, while this may sound like it's getting a bit kind of legally technical and it may seem not that relevant, this is quite important, because when we start talking about what rights are being violated, you know, the rights have to exist there in law before we can start talking about these laws as being violated. And because basically the guts of human rights laws are in existence there, that means that Israel should be complying with these. But rather it sees, like, when it responds to the treaty bodies, or when it responds to United Nations questions about what goes on in the occupied territory, it just tends to say, well, this is, you know, these laws aren't enacted there. This is not our sovereign territory. Now, in response to these arguments, the first one is that Israel is not the one who decides what laws are in action in that country or not. It's kind of more of a decision by the international community. The occupying power doesn't decide effective control. That's the international community. The next one is that effective control is the measurement. It's not sovereignty. It's not ownership of the land. And what you can see quite clearly here is that it is effective control in operation. Also, it can be seen in the blockade of the land, sea and air, that by exerting the blockade, as they are now, between the land, sea and the air in Gaza, that is demonstrating effective control. And finally, the excuse of that you need to have a physical presence there to have effective control is no longer needed, because, as you know nowadays, through the technology now, through drones or aeroplanes, or the ability for troops to move quickly in and out of an area, doesn't necessarily mean you need a physical presence there. Rather, it just means that, you know, you have the control and authority in that area. And so this has been widely accepted by the International Court of Justice in their rulings, the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and also other kind of human rights advisory or opinion bodies like Human Rights Watch, all agree that effective control is in action by Israel, and therefore Geneva Convention should apply. Now, the problem then with say, Geneva Convention 4, the Fourth Geneva Convention about the protection of civilians, is that this was drafted around the end of World War II and is kind of 50 or 60 years old. And so, in a sense, it addresses a different issue. The issue that it mainly addresses is kind of restricting or monitoring the power of the soldiers and the authority that they have, because this is what was the main concern in the 1930s and 40s. However, as we can see with occupied territory, the main concern is the humanitarian condition of the civilians. Now, while this is quite a part of the of Geneva Convention 4, it's really, most of the Geneva Convention 4 is about what the soldiers can do. And there are kind of statements about that humanitarian aid should be given, but in terms of the standards, in terms of exactly detailing how that humanitarian aid should get there, or how people should live their lives or be able to live, gain their livelihood, is not as clearly detailed in that. Also, as we can see, even if Geneva Convention 4 is there, it's all the bodies which say it is there, like the ICJ and the treaty bodies and Human Rights Watch, are opinion bodies. They're not really legal bodies. They can be legal bodies. The International Court of Justice is a law, but it gives its law as advisory opinions. In a case of Israel, like, if you have powerful friends, then you don't have to obey those rules. Also, we can see that just because a law is there doesn't necessarily mean that it's put into place or ordered there as well. Okay. So Next, in terms of now giving the kind of the legal framework, I want to now look at some of the more important concepts which are in place there. Because unpacking these concepts is important in terms of grounding what's going on in terms of international standards. So the first one there is the destruction of property, the first idea of the response by Israel of destroying property. Now, property can be destroyed in an act of conflict if there's a military objective there. So, like, if there are opposing soldiers in a house, house can be destroyed. If there are tanks coming across a bridge, say, then that bridge can be destroyed. So there are specific cases where property can be destroyed. Now, however, the case that you see, like in this movie, is that these are not conflict situations. When it's not a conflict situation, you can't destroy property. This is called punitive action. So to destroy a house because one of the people who lived there was a Hamas, or was a soldier, or an opposition combatant. Again, that's not illegal. The punitive destruction of houses is not the law. The law should be equal, and the punishment of the law is not the destruction of property, the destruction of houses. And this is called in the General Convention 4. You call this the wanton destruction, and this is what's occurring. The next thing is that about 3,500 houses have been destroyed, and most of these have been claimed to be destroyed because it's been used by the Hamas. This implies that they are a huge army with significant stockpiles and using massive amounts of houses for their military objectives. Quite clearly, this is not the case. What this is a case of collective punishment, which we'll look at later, where houses are just being destroyed because they may be near a house that is being used, or because they're near a road. But in all these cases, the destruction of property is quite clearly a violation of international laws. The impact of the destruction of houses also then destroys livelihoods. And what it seems is occurring is the destruction of houses and the destruction of property is to destroy the livelihood and destroy the economy. So cement factories have been targeted, food factories or food manufacturing has been targeted, water has been targeted. There's a lack of energy going into the area, into Gaza, which means that hospitals and electricity supply is also targeted. All these are targeting civilian uses. The bombing or the destruction of cement factories was because Hamas were supposedly using cement factories to build something, though it's not quite clear what that was. But in all these cases, this is just the destruction of an economy as a form of collective punishment. Okay. Now that's an important one. The next one, collective punishment, because this is also seen to be collective punishment has been an international crime or a war crime for quite some time. It was first introduced during World War II, in particular when villages were attacked or villages were destroyed because they were supporting freedom fighters. And so it was being used in the Nuremberg trials and in kind of post-World War II international law to say that you can't collectively punish. Now, what's been happening in Israel, you can see, is acts of collective punishment. Now, this has been defined by the ICJ and Human Rights Watch as well, saying that by targeting certain areas, targeting certain, say, blocks of houses, means that you're punishing everyone for one person's crime. Quite clearly, it's just quite a violation of quite basic laws, human rights of laws, innocent until proven guilty. Quite clearly that these people are being treated as guilty. Quite clearly, these people are being punished without any trial going on. So there is a widespread act of collective punishment. Also, it kind of heads towards discrimination as well, that you're just using punishment as a form of discrimination against a group of people. The collective punishment itself is quite rarely used. The only other example I could think of is North Korea, which uses the punishment of families. If someone defects, the family is punished. So quite clearly, it's a violation which should stop. Now, in response to that, Israel does have a right of self-defense. Israel has faced rocket attacks. There have been Israeli civilians which are being killed. There have been suicide bombers. And so this is a conflict situation, and Israel does have a right to protect itself. However, the rules of protection, the acts of self-defense, should be within certain international humanitarian laws. Now, where their acts of self-defense push the limits to these laws, or in fact violate these laws, are in a couple of areas. Firstly, in terms of proportionality. That is, that the response that you give should be proportional to the attack that you face. So, in the case of the recent blockade, much of this came out of the rocket attacks that Israel faced, and they did face some accounts say like up to 10,000 rockets were fired at Israel. I don't know the exact numbers, and of course it's going to be open to dispute. But one thing is that 3 people died with those rocket attacks. This is the figures that I've heard. It could be more, but still we're talking about not a lot of people dying from this. And so you'd expect a proportional response to that would be somewhere, would not result in hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians dying. So there's a disproportional response to the threat. The next point about proportionality is that your attack should be proportional to the kind of civilians which are in place there, to the civilian situation. Because if you're disproportionate, you're going to get too many civilian casualties. And you can see by the numbers of civilians who have been killed, and we're talking about hundreds, and also the numbers of children that have been killed, that the response has been disproportional. There were about, I think in 2009, there were like 50 or so children who were killed. This clearly shows a disproportional response, because proportional responses should be minimizing the number of civilian casualties. Okay. The next point here is military objectives, and that one of the rules of self-defense is that when you attack or undertake attacks against an opposition force, is that you must have military objectives. Now that means that you should be attacking either other combatants or other targets which have been identified as military objectives. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is that some of the soldiers, the combatants which they're fighting, don't clearly distinguish themselves from civilians, which makes it maybe more difficult. Also, that that where they're operating in the areas of Gaza is very dense, and it's easy to hide amongst civilians. So we can have some kind of sympathy there, but still, that means that the operation should be carried out with extreme care. Where with the numbers of civilian deaths, it just doesn't. Well, the international community just doesn't see that has happened. Okay. Now, another important point here is about what kind of crimes are we talking about? Because many of the things like destruction of property and targeting civilians are war crimes. But one of the terms which has been talked about more recently is crimes against humanity. Now, this was brought up in the Goldstone report, which was a UN report which came out in 2007, I think. But Goldstone said that there was most probably crimes against humanity committed by both Hamas and Israel. And in particular, the destruction of property by the Israeli Defense Forces could be seen as an act of a crime against humanity. Also, we talked about the Hamas rockets as being crimes against humanity. Now, crimes against humanity are important because this is like a very serious level of international crimes. It means that they can be judged, that the ICC can make or can ask for them to be prosecuted because of these. Also, that it implies that these people can be tried in other courts which may have universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. So, by calling them crimes against humanity can be an important step in terms of addressing the problems here. Okay. Now, lastly and briefly, I'll just touch on the issue of the blockade, which is the recent event. And this is a critical issue because one is that you can see again there's been a testing of the international laws here. Like it's not clear whether the blockade itself is legal. It's quite rare for countries to blockade themselves. The Americans did it during the Civil War, so 200 or 300 years ago. It did occur during the Biafran independence movement in Nigeria in the late 1960s. So it does occur, but it's quite rare. Now, the issue here for Israel is that if they want to have a blockade and say they're doing this as an act of war, it means that they've got to recognise those territories as occupied territories, and they must recognise the opposition forces as combatants, in which case they get prisoners of war status. But it doesn't want to do this. It wants to recognise the blockade as an act of war, but what goes on in Palestine is not part of an occupied force. So in a sense, it's kind of taking a bit of it's just selecting the parts of the law that it wants to use. Even if the blockade was illegal, you're still not allowed to stop humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid in all forms of international humanitarian law is unconditional. You can't stop humanitarian aid. So the act of blockading humanitarian aid, and this is things like food and water, is not allowed. Further, in the case of what happened recently in the boarding of the 6 ships, and I think 9 people were killed, is that if this is a blockade and they are merchant ships, you can't arrest the people on board. So there's a range of kind of where the law has been stretched or violated in a number of cases with the blockade. And also we can see, just as a final point, the blockade kind of heads back to this this concern that what we're seeing is a siege or collective punishment. And what we're seeing is not a military objective but targeting of civilians. So all of this kind of leads towards the conclusion that we can't really talk about any law. Well, we can't really talk about the laws of war being fulfilled, and we can talk about in many places quite significant violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Dr. Mike Hayes, thank you very much for a very necessary and interesting enlightenment. Well, as everyone will have seen, we have been joined by our third speaker, Dr. Pakon Priyakorn. Welcome. Good to see you. And we have spoken on the phone earlier, and he has had great difficulties in getting here tonight, so I thank him even more for defying the odds to get here, leaving at Nida at 6 o'clock, sitting in traffic jams, and then his car getting overheated and being stuck in Nana. But we are very, very happy that you got here. Would you please make your presentation?
Good evening. Thank you very much, Stuart, for inviting me to participating in this important event. May I introduce myself a bit? I am at the moment the president of the Foundation of Islamic Center of Thailand. So we have been running this type of activities for so many years in Bangkok and of course throughout Thailand, but we don't really have a sort of like this film you just gave me the day before yesterday. Of course, it's about Russian quarry, right? And in my view, I consider that demolishing civilian homes is a vicious and, of course, inhuman act of violence that violates Article 12 and Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course Article 33, 53 and 54 of the 4th Geneva Convention. It is very, very important to note at that place, because we consider about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights seem to be very important for us in running our activities to support the Palestine. In my view,